Okay, so the first question that I have, you've written this really wonderful paper that was commissioned by the Gates Foundation, talking about the difficulty of measuring impact in journalism and some of the wrong roads that people are going down to try to judge impact at this point. Can you maybe discuss why it is that it is so difficult, especially in a digital environment, to keep really focused on real impact?
Well, I think the first question is, I think focus is exactly the right word, and I think what I tried to say in the paper is that impact has quite a lot of different meanings, and that the most important thing, I think, particularly for a news organization, is to identify what exactly kind of impact it is trying to accomplish, and then to drive the measures from there. Right. The paper talks a lot about ProPublica and about how we think about measuring the impact of investigative reporting. And for us, that's been very clear from the beginning, which is we're trying to make real-world change, real reform. We're trying to produce journalism that leads to changes in policies, outcomes, legislation, behaviors, whatever. And so we focus on that. We keep very careful track of that, and we also, again, try to focus on that and put aside various other kinds of definitions of impact. I will say that that's ours. It is not the only one, and it may not even be appropriate for some other kinds of journalism. There may, for instance, and there certainly are, kinds of journalism in which what you would say, even in a nonprofit world, for instance, is we're trying to raise awareness, right? And we're trying to raise awareness of a particular subject, a particular issue, a set of issues. That seems to be a completely legitimate goal and a focus for a kind of organization. And if you were doing that, then you want to measure, what was awareness before we started and where is it now, and with respect in general, or by story or series or whatever. So I think the first thing I'm trying to say in the paper is the most important thing to understand are your own goals and your own definitions, and to try to use some of these terms that get used with great imprecision with a greater degree of precision.
So you're an investigative news site, and how is it? What's your focus when you're measuring the impact that you want to have? You have a very specific goal, which is to change things.
Right.
So how do you measure progress towards that goal and achievement of the goal itself? What does ProPublica do?
We literally track stories that are successful in that respect, and then the rest of them are not. And let's be very clear, most of them are not. Right? The other thing I think that's always useful with metrics is you want to understand, how much is success, right? I talk a little bit about baseball because baseball is very widely understood, not universally, but pretty widely. And one of the things people understand about baseball is that hitting in baseball, success 30% of the time is a very, very high quality level. That's the general standard of excellence, is success 30% of the time, which means the very, very best people fail well more than 60% of the time. There is no one who doesn't fail at that level, at the highest level of excellence in baseball. There is no one who does not fail more than 60% of the time. And if you fail 70% of the time, you're doing very, very well. On the other hand, you fail 80% of the time, you're not. Now, baseball's got a history of 120 years, many, many thousands of iterations. It is very unlikely that digital journalism today is going to be able to operate with that kind of precision on the limited history that we have. But you should have some intuitive sense. Are we expecting to have whatever we define as impact all of the time? Once a year? a few times a year? What is it? And, for us, it is a few times a year, 10 times a year perhaps, where we could say some important change occurred in the world as a direct result of our journalism.
Right.
We actually happen to have a decent, although small, example that we wrote about just this morning. A few weeks ago, we did a story about sober homes in New York, and a particular group of them that seemed to be involved in kickbacks and the abuse of residents and the waste of public funds. We have a follow-up story this morning that reports that 8 days after that story appeared, the regulators who have been largely asleep at the switch in this area raided the place that was described in our story, conducted a 5-day surprise inspection. They have not said what the results of that are, but I think it's very clear that that was a consequence of our story. And I expect that at some point it will become clear that there will be results. So that's what we mean by impact. If they find the home, if they put it out of business, if they require a consent decree, whatever it will be, that is the kind of thing we measure. We measure it anecdotally. And then, and I hope this is one of the key insights in the paper, if there are any, I think transparency becomes enormously clear. The best way to, I think, hold yourself to a standard of rigor and real impact is to say, when you think you've identified the impact, here it is. We're going to claim it publicly. We're going to talk about it in our reports. We're going to put it up on our website. We're going to announce we think we accomplished this. And the importance of that comes from the fact that, A, that has its own discipline. If you know you're going to do that, you won't do it lightly. And if you do it publicly and you're wrong, in the modern world, you're likely to be almost instantaneously corrected.
Yes.
And you know it. So I think the transparency of it is the best check on it being legit.
So this gets to a kind of an interesting issue for us, and I have a couple of other questions to ask you about the paper, but I want to ask you this first. We do a lot of our reporting in increments. So we'll follow a story literally for a year before we get to a point where we realize that there's something earth-shaking to say about what it is that's going on. Because we do follow it in a tracking kind of a way, very publicly. So in that kind of a situation, and other people have picked up on the story and one thing and another, really how able are you to claim responsibility for something like that? Well,
it's like a little bit like what Justice Stewart said about pornography. I tend to think you know it when you see it.
Okay.
In theory, that is a very, very difficult problem. In practice, I have found that it is not such a difficult problem.
People know.
You know.
Yeah.
And as I say, if you're in sufficient doubt yourself that you're nervous about claiming credit for it, then it may be that you don't deserve the credit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, can you talk a little bit about the connection of impact to both reach and to engagement?
Yeah, I think impact is a word that's been used to mean a lot of things. As I say, for ProPublica, we define impact as change. But a lot of people, when they talk about impact, talk about it very loosely, and reach and engagement are both ways, both concepts that people use the word impact to mean. As long as they are your goals, this goes back to my first point, they could be perfectly appropriate definitions. If, for instance, you are trying to build awareness, then reach is a very relevant measure. Because obviously you can't build awareness with people that you aren't communicating with.
Right.
On the other hand, if you're measuring change, reach is actually not directly related.
Mm-hmm.
It may overlap or it may not.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big impact successes we ever had was 4 years ago. We ran a series with the Los Angeles Times about the quality of nursing oversight in California. And the main story appeared on Sunday in the LA Times. And at that time, California's governor was an action hero who walked into his office the next day brandishing a copy of the paper and said, this is an outrage, and I want it addressed by the end of the day.
That's pretty, yeah.
And he did. This doesn't happen very much in journalism, as you know, but and he fired the entire state nursing board before the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So now this gets us back to reach. It's really nice that story ran on the front page of the LA Times and across 4 inside pages, but the truth is that it was reaching one person that had the impact. I don't know how many people, how many of the other 400,000, 600,000, 700,000 people who then read the Sunday LA Times read the story, and frankly, it doesn't really matter. He read it, it reached him, and he could act on it, and he did.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the reach could be it could act as a kind of a proxy for public embarrassment. So
no, for sure,
yeah.
Right? I mean, had he read it in a private memo, would he have walked into the office on Monday brandishing it or not? Who the heck knows? And you'd have to get inside his head, which I don't really want to do.
Yeah.
Engagement. Again, the question is engagement the object of the game? If you are trying, for some kinds of work, there's no question that it is. If you're trying to enlist people in a movement, if you're trying to just build participatory democracy, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why you could care about engagement. Or there are kinds of things of which engagement is a good measure. For instance, the effectiveness of a feature story, I think, as opposed to a news story, engagement is a good measure of the effectiveness, just the journalistic effectiveness,
mm-hmm.
of a feature story. But the question always goes back to the first question, which is that your goal?
Right.
And if that is your goal, if your goal is we want to write the best possible feature stories, then engagement may well be the right measure.
Mm-hmm.
If your goal is we want to change the world, look, I mean, some hundreds of thousands of Tea Party people were just very engaged in the effort to defund Obamacare. I'm sure we could prove that mathematically. It accomplished absolutely nothing. And it would be the wrong measure of success. Because then you could say, we got all these people all riled up, so we won, right? Well, no, actually you lost.
Okay, and let's talk just for a second, because I really liked your discussion in the paper of the connection between journalism and advocacy. And what that relationship is. I thought that was really a brilliant discussion. So can you just talk a little bit about what's the history of that? And
well, the history, of course, is complicated, tortured and complicated. But I would say this: the most important distinction to me, and both things are completely legitimate. Some of my best friends are advocates. I give some of my personal money to advocacy organizations. We are not an advocacy organization. We are a journalism organization. And the principal distinction that I would draw is that journalism, particularly investigative journalism, starts with questions and ends with answers. Advocacy starts with answers.
Mm-hmm.
When you think you know what the problem is, what the solution is, and you're just trying to drive the world toward the solution, That is advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
It's a completely legitimate function, but that is not our function. We try to find things that people don't understand, that we don't understand, and figure out why they work, why they are happening. Sometimes, and this is where it gets tricky and where I'm not sure everyone in journalism would agree with me, I do think it's perfectly appropriate if you started from questions, but actually eventually come to answers, to say, look, we've looked into this very carefully, and the answer is X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm.
And there really isn't any question about it anymore. That is not, to me, advocacy. That is simply reasoning from facts.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example. We recently did a big project about Tylenol, and the abuse of Tylenol and the dangers of Tylenol. Tylenol is the #1 cause of liver failure in the United States. It is the cause of 150 accidental deaths a year. It's also actually the cause of the immediate precipitating or device for a lot of suicides.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no question when you look into this that those suicides are facilitated by the way, some of the ways in which Tylenol is packaged in this country, available in huge bottles of zillions of capsules. In Europe, and particularly in Britain, they've known this for a long time, and they have dramatically limited the packaging of Tylenol. So it's limited to, I think, 12 pills at a time and blister packs and stuff like that. When they did that, among the other effects of it were the suicide by Tylenol in Britain almost disappeared overnight. Now, I'm sure some of those people found other ways to commit suicide. But there is no question that we would reduce the number of suicides by Tylenol in this country if we mandated different kinds of packaging. Now, you can argue the pros and cons of that altogether, but that's a fact. That's not advocacy. That's something we have researched and I can prove to you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you could say it's not the end of the world if people commit suicide using Tylenol and we're unconcerned. Or it's not worth the inconvenience of making people buy the stuff more often.
Mm-hmm.
That's fine. You could say that. But to me, that at that point, we're not talking about advocacy. We're talking about reasoning from journalism.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's switch now, unless you have something else that you want to say.
I don't know.
Okay. Let's switch now and talk a little bit about, I sent you our business plan.
Yep.
And I just thought that it would be useful for us to understand what are your thoughts about it, challenges about it.
Oh, well, I mean...
And you know, our intention is to be the journal of record for the civil sector, which I realize, considering our size, is very ambitious. But I think our feeling is that the sector has been terribly underreported over the years and sloppily reported because people don't necessarily understand some of the dynamics and reality. So
I have to say, I feel like I'll be better able to respond to particular questions than to sort of give you an overall view. I read this. There is a lot of very useful information here. As I may have said, I would love to see more direct competitive data. I would love to see more stuff on questions like, what is the exact profit and loss statement of advertising. I will say that one thing I will say one thing about multi-year business plans in the digital publishing space these days overall, and that is, I think one needs to be very careful about excessive precision. There is an enormous amount of uncertainty in this field. We've been at this 5 or 6 years now. The field is already very different from what it was when we started. There are things that are very difficult to foresee that change from year to year. For instance, ProPublica has 240,000 Twitter followers now. It's the second largest traffic driver for us after our daily email. Mm-hmm. That was completely, well, it may have been foreseeable in 2008, but we certainly didn't foresee it, and I think almost no one did.
Right.
So what that tells me is the idea, I will be very honest with you, we have no plan for 2015.
I appreciate that. Only a man with some capital in his pocket would be able to say.
I don't have very much capital in my pocket. I just don't want to be misleading people.
Right.
It's October 2013. I have a plan for 2014. Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. Way before 2015 starts, we'll have a plan. I can tell you what the default glide path is for 2015. I can tell you what our obligations are for 2015. I can tell you what our, what we can count on the upside for 2015. But to tell you that I am ready to make the 2015 plan when I haven't seen the 14 plan pan out, would suggest that this is a mature business. And in our case, it's just not. As I may have said to you the other day, I came out of the newspaper business. I was 15 years at the Wall Street Journal, ultimately as the assistant publisher. I think I understand the newspaper business pretty well. I have no idea what's going to happen to the New York Times in 2016. I just don't have any idea.
Right.
And honestly, I don't think they do either. And they've been around for, even under current management, 120 years. They do have a mature business, but it is subject to a lot of change. Mm-hmm. That is nothing compared to the kind of change to which we are subject. So to get back to my first point, I would be very wary of out-year precision because I think it is fundamentally, necessarily misleading.
Right. I think you're absolutely right. So I appreciate that. Let me ask you one additional question, which is we're getting ready to try to hire somebody to take a position such as yours in our organization. Now, you seem that you are an incredibly entrepreneurial human being.
Maybe it helps.
Right, and I think that the other people that I've met in these kinds of positions who are successfully positioning their organizations are also very kind of almost wildly entrepreneurial, really looking out over the horizon constantly. How much of that is what you do every day?
I certainly don't feel like I am being wildly entrepreneurial 6 hours a day. But I think the attitude probably is important. It goes back to this issue of constant change and comfort with change and wanting change to be your friend as opposed to your enemy. I think it's always present attitudinally. It's like any other job. Most of what you do every day is the mundane stuff that needs to be done every day. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, I sign almost all the checks here. I mean, that's not terribly entrepreneurial. And I review the financial statements and,
right.
And I mean, the day-to-day HR stuff and finance stuff are done by somebody who works for me, but, I'm pretty deep in that with her all the time. And so that's a lot of real life.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is extremely useful. I think we're, you know, we are very anxious to see what this change is going to do for us. So I probably am going to be asking you for a lot more advice as we go along.
I guess the one thing that I would say is, because I think it's a common mistake, I think the number of people who are great editors and great managers, in my experience in 30 years of hanging around with journalists, is very low.
Mm.
And asking an editor to become a business person rarely works out well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm living proof.
No, I don't mean that at all. I just, there are different things. And the other thing to remember is, if somebody's trying to do both things, every minute they're not doing one, every minute they're doing one is a minute they're not doing the other.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I do think it's very important, actually, for organizations, as quickly as they can afford both, to have two people doing these two very different things.
It's interesting. Now, can I just ask you one add-on question? I'm sorry, I told you that was going to be the last one. But the other thing that the board is going to be looking at in this period is just the relationship between the two positions. What's your experience, especially in these new style organizations? What's your experience about the relationship between the chief editorial person and the chief business person or publisher?
You know, the way we have it organized now, at first at ProPublica, Paul Steiger, who was our founder, presided over both. Although Paul is by training and temperament an editor, and frankly, he left me mostly to run the business side myself from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But he was ultimately in charge, and he made all the key decisions. And he's now sort of moving into semi-retirement. We now have two people who are peers doing this. Steve Engelberg is our editor-in-chief, and I'm our president, and we both report to our board.
Mm-hmm.
We've been working together 5 years. It works very well. It's quite seamless. We both come out of newspaper cultures, so I think we have an appreciation for the distinction. We've been at this under this scheme for more than 9 months, and we have not had a single decision where either of us was confused about whose decision the decision was.
Right.
You know, so we're talking about a lot of things that are up to him to decide or up to me to decide, but at the end of the day, and you know, we're partners and we're in and out of each other's office every day, but all day every day, but we're pretty clear on who's doing what.
Right.
So I do think that can work. I mean, classic business school would say you can't. I actually think in journalism it might work a little more easily because there is this historic and cultural distinction between the two sides.
Right.
Mutual respect certainly is critical. You know, if it can't work that way, you know, either one could report to the other in theory.
Right.
I don't think there's a right answer to that. Even if one does report to the other, I think it's very important that people have the latitude. Otherwise, in their respective field, because otherwise, you either have a business person running editorial who isn't an editorial person. That's not likely to work well. And conversely, an editorial person who is not really a business person, making ultimate business judgments, actually, in my experience, equally is not likely to work out well.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you can have the reporting relationship either way, but I think the main thing is these are two different roles. Journalism has grown up understanding that they very much are and need to be. The formal structure worries me a little bit less than the need for mutual respect and clarity.
Right. Yeah. I definitely agree. Well, this is going to be very useful. Are there anything else you would like to say to our board? Keep the faith. Whatever.
Yeah, keep the faith. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
You've got a great service you're providing. It matters to a lot of people.
Thank you, Dick. And I will be talking to you soon.
Okay, very good, Ruth. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.